Hi guys, before we get into it, a very quick disclaimer that you'll find all my other Amicus reviews in my Amicus playlist, and there will be spoilers today, although I will refrain from giving away the ending because I'm kind. So The Skull is about a skull, funnily enough, that used to belong to a guy called the Marquis de Sade, but at the beginning of our tale it's being passed around the curator-collector's scene as an item of worth, but it's cursed because the person it used to belong to, he was a heinous man. He committed lots of vile crimes. He spent the final few years of his life living in a dungeon, but the evil within him stayed in his bones after death. So anybody who has the skull now is in big trouble, because this skull can make people kill other people. It can will people into committing suicide. And the person it goes to in this movie eventually is a curator played by Peter Cushing. I can't remember the character name. I'm just going to refer to him as Peter Cushing. We've also got Christopher Lee in this. We've got Patrick Wymark, who I've only previously seen, I think, in Where Eagles Dare. He played the double agent who jumps out of the plane at the end. And he plays a weasel-type character in this as well. Maybe that's just something this particular actor did. And holding everything together in the director's chair, Freddie Francis, very reliable guy, did lots of Hammer films, lots of Amicus films. Going back to Lee and Cushing, obviously, these two did a lot of films together, both before and after The Skull, but I can't think of too many times where they've played characters who are friends with each other or have to work together. But you get that in this film, and it struck me as something that I've not seen that often in Lee Cushing ventures. So they both play curators in this. We get a really interesting scene where they're playing snooker together in Christopher Lee's billiards room. This was really fun for me because I'm a big snooker fan. So I got to see here two of my favourite actors of all time playing one of my favourite sports of all time, although clearly neither Lee nor Cushing had played much snooker before, because the way they hold the cue is really poor. The technique's just off. Sometimes you can see the shots that they're taking. The camera is literally focused on the table, and they miss the balls by so much. It's like, yeah, never played snooker before. At one point, Christopher Lee goes to the scoreboard and adds 10 points on, and I thought to myself, there's no way you've made a break of 10 during the last few bits of dialogue that I've been watching. No way. But going back to the overall film of The Skull, this was based upon a short story called The Skull of the Marquis de Sade, I think. So the ironic thing there is that the short story has a really long title and the long feature-length version has a short title. It was written by a guy called Robert Bloch. This guy wrote a lot of the stories that you see in the Amicus anthology films. He was probably the most prolific writer in all of those anthology films. I know this because I've read this book about Amicus. A very, very good book. It talks mainly about the Amicus anthology films, but it also speaks a bit as well about the standalones. And yeah, Robert Bloch, very, very prolific. He wrote the original short story upon which this film is based, and you can tell that this started its life as a short story because parts of the runtime have clearly been padded here and there. For example, there's a moment where Peter Cushing's character wakes up in an apartment, and the natural thing to do here in any script would be to just have Cushing go into the apartment and discover the dead body, as he's meant to do at that point. But instead, he goes back home, speaks to his wife, not much happens, and then he comes back to the apartment, and we spend an extra 5 minutes getting to a place where we already were, And this happens 2 or 3 times during the movie, where there are obvious ways in which they've just padded out the story a little bit. 'Cause I think they rushed this film out a little bit. I think they were desperate to get a standalone horror film out there to compete with Hammer, and they've picked this short story that Robert Bloch had. They were obviously in contact with Bloch because he'd been contributing loads of stories to things like Dr. Terror's House of Horrors and maybe some of the anthology films to come, and they've just decided to adapt this short story, and they've done it very, very quickly. Now, it's not that it's impossible to do a full-length film about an inanimate object, because the Annabelle trilogy in recent times, those films feel like full-length films. They're not padded in any way, but The Skull is, and I think that's just a sign that they really did rush to get this out. But despite that, I still actually really enjoyed it. Cushing's character is called Maitland. I've just looked it up off camera, and Wymark's character is called Marco. I love the relationship between these two. That they're from completely different walks of life, and yet I just love the way that they interact with each other. It's not quite a friendship, but at the same time, there's no animosity between them. They barter with each other in a really cordial and respectful way. I just really like it. But there's a strange wealth gap here, given the fact that they both do the same thing for a living. I mean, they are both buyers and sellers of antiques, but Maitland is this really wealthy guy. He's got a huge house. His study is like a bat cave. It's huge. He's got a safe behind his desk that's got thousands of pounds in it. Somebody comes round with an old book and says, "Do you want to buy this old book for 200 quid?" Maitland just whipped the cash out of his safe. Yeah, no problem, without even thinking about it. And bear in mind, back in 1965, 200 quid was probably £1,000 or something. He's even got like a fake book cover that he's invested in that sits in front of his safe and it can flip open and shut. He's got a maid as well. At the other end of the scale, Marco is so broke, he's living in a one-bedroom rented apartment. It looks like a real flea pit as well. So how do these two characters end up like this, given the fact that they do exactly the same thing for a living? But the study where Maitland spends most of his time in, it's amazing. What a fantastic set. The shape of it's interesting. There's so much space for Cushing to move around in when he's doing his bits. There's mostly artefacts in the middle of the room and then books on the outside, but it looks frigging awesome. If I go back to Annabelle again, more specifically the Conjuring universe in general, the Warrens have this room with artefacts in it that pretty much serves the same purpose as Maitland's study. But the Warrens version is tiny. It's like a little garage out back. James Wan really screwed up with that. He should have taken note from the skull and given the Warrens something like what Maitland has. That would have been brilliant. I've already said that Maitland has a maid, but the female characters in this film hardly get anything to do. And this is something that I noticed in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors as well, which was the first Amicus film I reviewed last week. 5 characters on a train, all having their futures foretold. Not one of them's a woman. And I don't think that would happen if the film came out nowadays. I don't know if there was a big effort among people like Milton Sobotski in charge of Amicus to try and not go down the Hammer Glamour route, just, do something different with these films. But there's just not many female characters in these first 2 Amicus films I've reviewed. In this film, I think Jill Bennett plays Maitland's wife, but she's not in the film much, really, which is strange given her close proximity to all the action that takes place. The last 20 minutes, she's asleep while everything's just going off around her in the rooms and corridors outside. The maid hardly does anything. I think she answers the door twice. She's a pointless character. They might as well have just not hired the maid actress and just got the wife to open the door. It would have given that actress a few more things to do. So, most important question of all, does this film bring the horror? And I would say that the dial just about falls onto the yes side of the divide. There are 2 really good scare sequences in this film, the first of which involves some kind of hallucination that Maitland is having. Now, when this started, I wasn't actually enjoying this portion of the film because I thought what was going on was real. And it's just too weird. Like, Maitland gets arrested by some Men in Black type figures, and then he's thrust in front of a judge, and then he's made to play Russian roulette. And I'm thinking to myself, what has happened to the film at this point? This is absolute bollocks. And then Maitland actually attempts to fire 3 bullets into his skull. Nobody would ever do that voluntarily. So when it was revealed to me that this was all a dream, I was very happy. And then there's a terrific moment where Maitland ends up in this red room with the walls closing in and there's gas coming in. And suddenly the skull is right in front of his face, and that moment gave me a start, I can tell you. The end of the film is very good as well. It's like a battle between Maitland and the skull. It's a bit weird how quiet everything is. There's no dialogue happening. It's also quite weird that there are people asleep in the house not getting involved in all this. But it's quite effective, and I'm not going to spoil how it turns out. In terms of kills, there's a bit of a variance in quality in this film. There's a good one where this landlord figure gets pushed off a balcony and you see him fall through some glass quite far below, and it actually looks like a bloke might be doing this stunt. On the other hand, I mean, it could just be a crash test dummy and they got lucky with how it looks, but it was still a moment where I thought, oh, that's actually been done really, really well. But on the flip side, there's a death in the prologue which isn't very good. So we follow this guy for a while who digs up the skull. He's the first victim in this film. He's the one who gets the ball rolling. He takes the skull back to his apartment, and the skull makes him commit suicide, but we don't actually see it. It's all done off camera, and we got a long build-up to this, for then to us not see anything. It's a little bit disappointing. And then later on in the film, I think we come back to this prologue from a different angle, and it just all feels a bit unnecessary. It's yet another example of where this film was trying to fill out its runtime as best it could. But on the whole, I still really enjoyed this film. It's got legendary actors, great production design, at least 2 great scare sequences that are positioned quite far apart. I just think it could have done with maybe one more rewrite, just insert more situations and story so that we don't obviously notice quite a few sections where things have just been inserted just to fill out the runtime. But still, this is a great start to our review series because I loved Dr. Terror, and this is a very good film as well. Before we wrap up, I'll quickly show you the version of the film that I own for this. So here is my Blu-ray copy of The Skull. I bought it just last week. I think it cost me either £12 or £13, I can't remember, but a decent price for a Blu-ray which has definitely been remastered. I think it's very strong audio and visuals here. Not much in the way of features. There's a few interviews with people like Kim Newman and Jonathan Rigby, but no documentary, no commentary. But on the inside, there is a booklet all about the making of the film and posters and stills and things like that. I think it's like 32 pages. This was not advertised with the Blu-ray, so to open up the box and discover that this was in there was definitely a thrill. Very happy with this copy, and the film is sufficiently good enough that I think I could see myself watching it again in the future, so I'm very happy to add it to my shelf. But for now, let's get to the bag of terror and see how we're going to score this thing. So we got 1, 2, 3, 3.5 bloody axes out of 5. Decent film, and I'm looking forward to moving on to the next one, which I can tell you now is a film called The Psychopath. I ordered it last week and it just turned up yesterday. So until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.